Professor Ryszard Legutko is an academic, a philosopher, a politician, and an author. He is the professor of philosophy at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, where he specializes in ancient philosophy and political theory. He is currently a member of the European Parliament from Poland, where he sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee and is deputy chairman of the Conservatives and Reformers parliamentary group. He has held several elected as well as appointed offices, including member of the Polish Senate, where he served as deputy speaker, former education minister, and former secretary of state in the chancellery of President Kaczynski. He is the author of numerous commentaries and books, including Plato's Critique of Democracy, Toleration, a treatise on liberty, and an essay on the Polish soul. His most recent book, The Demon in Democracy, Totalitarian Temptations in Free Societies, was published in 2016 and has led one critic to describe him as a political prophet. Professor Legutko will discuss the origins of cancel culture and its Polish variant.
Cancel culture is the last so far stage of the war that the Western civilization has waged against itself. For some time we have heard that a lot of what this civilization has stood for is unacceptable, should be criticized, debunked, deconstructed. But now we are told that it should be cancelled in its entirety. This hasty and radical conclusion is partly due to the fact that cancel culture has become a political fashion and therefore popular among those groups whose links with culture in the proper sense of the word, that is, the products of the mind and artistic imagination, has been rather loose, and who for this reason have natural ease to make outrageous and silly pronouncements. But the artists and the academics also joined the war, and unsurprisingly, a lot of them on the cancel side. Let me give an example of Dan L. Padilla Peralta, a classical scholar professor of Roman history at Princeton. Here is what he said about classical studies. Quote, "If one were intentionally to design a discipline whose institutional organs and gatekeeping protocols were explicitly aimed at disavowing the legitimate status of scholars of color, one could not do better than what classics has done," unquote. He also condemned the field as, quote unquote, "equal parts vampire and cannibal," and a dangerous force that has been used to murder, enslave, and subjugate. "I hope the field dies, and it dies as swiftly as possible," he said. But cancel culture has not been invented in America in the wake of the Black Lives Matter turmoil. Following the French Revolution, the Basilica of Saint-Denis, for centuries the resting place of the kings of France, and an architectural gem was vandalized, the tombs of the kings were desecrated, the royal remains destroyed. This was not the only example in revolutionary France. Communism provides even more examples, with churches turned into warehouses and museums of atheism, palaces into military barracks. The politically incorrect names of the streets were changed, the politically incorrect memorials destroyed, books were tampered with, some entirely banned, some having the politically incorrect parts deleted and replaced by correct versions. Each time, whether in France or in Russia, the idea behind these acts of destruction was that previous history had to be cancelled or humiliated because it symbolized oppression, tyranny, class exploitation, as well as the odious ideas that justified all this. The symbols provoked anger, rejection, and a desire to eradicate them once and for all. The assumption was that once the symbolic roots of tyranny disappear, mankind can start anew, and the world will become more just, because injustice, having lost its right of symbolic presence, will ultimately lose ground. So what has been recently happening in America is not something extraordinary. However, many people find it puzzling that it broke out in a society in which, one would think, the past sins, whatever they were, have been atoned for, and that there is neither room nor need nor acceptance of the repetition of neo-Jacobine or neo-Bolshevik practices. I use these analogies deliberately as they represent a similar frame of mind. Fortunately, the means used are much milder today. We do not have guillotine or revolutionary courts. But let these differences do not make us complacent. The law about these matters has become more restrictive. The desire for cancellation is more brutal, and nothing indicates that the oppressive wave will recede in the foreseeable future. The first thing that strikes any open-minded observer in all cases is the total absence of self-restraining impulses. After all, we have been taught to love our country, respect our heroes, honor our symbols, and understand the metaphysical and religious tradition of Western culture. When we imagine a person that is deprived of all this and has no internal self-restraint against the destruction of the symbolic structures on which his culture has been built, the concept that most adequately renders these qualities would be a barbarian or a savage. But this answer is not satisfactory and begs the question, whence the savages in the most civilized societies? I would argue, which is not a very original thesis, that these are homegrown barbarians, including university professors, not foreign invaders. The question is then the following: which ideas underlying the modern Western civilization account for this unrestrained desire to submit our culture to these brutal acts of amputation? Let me mention some of them. The first is egalitarianism. In modernity, equality has turned out to be the paramount principle from which most political movements and most revolutions have been deriving their energy to rebuild the world. Socialism, communism, liberalism, postmodernism, Protestantism, French Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, the sexual revolution, democratic revolutions and evolutions. Tocqueville was right in pointing it out, and so was his commentator François Furet, who indicated equality as the obsession of our societies. There are several things to be said about equality. First, that striving for it never ends, because one cannot even imagine such a state of affairs that one could not inspire to more equality. The more equality we get, the more inequalities we discover. In today's world, the fact that women become pregnant and men don't is considered an assault on equality. Literary canon is another example of outrageous inequality, or the parents' authority over their children, or the teachers' authority over their students. Even arithmetic has been accused of propagating white supremacy. Why should the classical studies, to go back to Padilla Peralta and his rant on this field, undermine, quote unquote, the legitimate status of scholars of color? The only answer we can derive from his remarks is slavery, a well-established institution in Rome. And since slavery is such an evil thing, it contaminates not only Greece and Rome, but also the study of Greece and Rome. When in his scholarly pursuits, a professor of classical studies ignores ancient slavery, he thereby accepts it and indirectly accepts its alleged consequences today. Therefore, let me quote the Princeton professor again, the production of whiteness turns on closer examination to reside in the very marrows of classics, unquote. If the professor of classical studies does not ignore slavery, he must condemn it all the time and the entire field that did not give it sufficient attention, and by the same token that it endorsed it. The second point about equality is that since we are never satisfied with the amount of equality we have, the need for a revolution is always there. The sexual revolution surprised the Western world as it emerged a few years after the learned and serious social philosophers declared that there wouldn't be any revolutions because in a modern affluent society, the only problems to be solved are technical ones, and that the chiastic visions would no longer capture our imagination. The Black Lives Matter Tamil also surprised many people, since it was widely accepted that most of what could be done about the US racial problems was done, or was being done, both by the government and by the people at large. Third, the preoccupation with equality shuts us off from history. Why should we respect history or even learn from historical experience? In the light of egalitarian ideology, history has no secrets, no treasures to be discovered. History is a chronicle of inequalities and a chronicle of a struggle against those equalities. From the egalitarian perspective, it is impossible to discern history as a reality where we would find noble ideas, the ideas that are worth having, or a reflection of the world that disappeared but was once sufficiently rich that getting to know it would enlarge our sensibilities, or a record of moral and philosophical insights about which we forgot, which never lost their validity. History is a repulsive testimony of repression, discrimination, and bigotry. Fourth, the supreme role of equality changes our view of tyranny. Tyranny is defined as inequality. This goes back to early modern philosophy and was a clear departure from ancient and medieval philosophers' view, for whom tyranny was arbitrary power and lawlessness. Once we redefined tyranny along the modern lines, we had a different view of today's society. Its tyrannical aspects leap to the eye, and we know that tyranny can be abolished only by a revolution. Cancel culture is therefore perceived as a fight against tyranny, not as being a form of a tyranny itself, just as the French revolutionaries perceived the symbolic execution of the dead kings at Saint-Denis as a triumph of free spirit, not as an act of revolutionary and tyrannical barbarism. Fifth, the more egalitarian the society is, the more political it becomes. Once the old structures based on equality are delegitimized, politics and political ideologies are the only tools to organize a society and legitimize its institution. Everything becomes political. One no longer sees a film as a work of art or entertainment, but as a political statement. The statement may be correct or incorrect. Family, life, religion, schools, advertisements, fashion, computer games, everything contains a political message which should be monitored and the dangerous content eliminated. Culture and history can be relatively free of politics. They were once. Culture is an object of contemplation, source of wisdom, object of delight and inspiration to disinterested pursuits for the sake of pursuit. All this is simply inconceivable today. But egalitarianism as such is not the only source of cancel culture. Another one goes back to Marxism, particularly its concept of false consciousness. The concept emerged from a conviction that the ruling class controls the people by instilling into their minds a set of views that legitimize the existing injustices and prevent human beings from understanding the repressive nature of the system in which they live. Enslavement, Marx said, has its deepest roots in the way that we think and speak, in the association that we have, in the stereotypes through which we interpret the world. This view generated a strategy that one can find in many revolutions. Existing culture, both high and low, is an enemy as the foundation of the discrimination. It should be destroyed and replaced with a new one. First, the prima facie attitude to culture is mistrust and hostility, but on the whole, a belief that it is just a means to an end. Either the enemies use the culture as the means to the end, or we use it as a means to our end and destroy the cultural arsenal. Marxism also introduced an intellectual device to depict society as a conflict-ridden, profoundly unjust place. The core of this device was the concept of class struggle. The mechanism of the change was a war between antagonistic classes. In other words, the history of community is, according to Karl Marx, a history of a class struggle that has been waged from time immemorial and will continue until the final revolution occurs and the last of the exploited classes, the proletariat, will crush the last exploiters, the capitalist bourgeoisie, and by defeating them, they will emancipate the mankind. The combination of these two concepts, false consciousness and class struggle, led to a theory according to which political transformation has to be accompanied by a mental transformation. In Marxism, there were controversies which factor was logically or causally prior to which, but it was generally agreed that both were indispensable. Until recently, the concepts of class struggle and false consciousness had a rather limited impact in Western societies, usually taken up and politically employed by the communist parties and their allies. The prevailing view was that in those societies managed to lower the tension of social economic conflicts considerably, and that some kind of deliberation among the divergent points of view was possible, and therefore the tensions could be decreased and satisfactory solutions found. Things have changed when, in the wake of the sexual revolution, to the notion of class, two other notions were added, race and gender. In light of this modification, the Western societies lost their rather optimistic image of conflict-solving, deliberative, balanced organism and acquire a more sinister appearance. True, the workers did not yearn for revolution to shake off the chains and to earn the means of survival. But once the struggle was extended to the conflict between races and between genders, everything changed. Practically, the entire society became permeated with evil. Let us take race. In the beginning, the concept of race referred to the white people and black people, the former enslaving the latter, or if not enslaving in the literal sense of the word, then degrading them to the status of inferior human beings. Later, however, the concept of race was reinterpreted to cover a lot more. For instance, the domination of European culture, an alleged race-based bias of the artistic canon or classical studies. In fact, any Eurocentrist statement or any act of positive singling out of the Western civilization was condemned as racist and white supremacist. The concept of gender turned out to be even more fecund. At first, the political narrative about men discriminating against women, but then the concept of gender appeared, taken from the standard terminology of descriptive grammar and giving a rather absurdly opaque meaning. It soon denoted anything that anyone could claim to be his sexual preference. In fact, the pronoun his is inappropriate, and so is her, because gender in its new meaning invalidated all pronouns, all of them being insufficiently opaque and dangerously binary. The genders were said to be many, no one knows how many. Any limitation of the number was considered discriminatory. The neo-Marxist new first has taken root in America. From their perspective, America has been torn by the enduring but often hidden conflicts between infinitely many groups, ethnic, racial, sexual, and that the American minds have been overpowered by the false ideas that downplayed these conflicts, and all these ideas found a fertile ground in America. The neo-Marxists disclosed to the Americans what seemed like an ocean of injustice, a massive violation of principle of equality by means of perfidious instruments of oppression, the more perfidious that they allegedly blurred out our cognitive, emotional, and imaginative faculties, which would have enabled us to detect them. The neo-Marxism also disclosed a shockingly number of victims whose existence the Americans apparently had not been even aware before. Not only classes were subdued, not only races was now exposed in its enormous monstrosity, whose hateful touch polluted every aspect of life. The ideology of German in its myriad forms were now the greatest providers of the victims and of the crimes perpetrated against them. Then comes the third pillar of cancel culture, besides egalitarianism and neo-Marxism, liberalism. From the very beginning, the liberals proclaimed themselves to be defenders of freedom and had definite answer to the question of how to secure freedom in a society. Human beings, they said, should be given rights. And since liberals were also, or primarily egalitarians, at least most of them, they said that all human beings should be given rights as all men are created equal. The liberals, therefore, also took the modern view that tyranny is inequality. But this was a poor conceptual equipment vis-à-vis a formidable enemy. Not only was the equipment insufficient to confront the armies of the cancel culture, but liberals never even tried to confront them, and instantly they became their allies, being overwhelmed by the alleged scale of newly discovered inequalities, by the number of groups discriminated against. The liberals did what seemed to them obvious and morally imperative, unaware that this was a self-destructive move. Once again, they invoked the rights, the universal solution, and granted those rights to every new group that, according to the neo-Marxist ideology, existed or was brought into being or constituted itself or simply claimed privileges. But they went further than that. After having accepted the neo-Marxist list of the new victims, they also had to accept the list of the new oppressors. The moment the liberals joined, or as often is the case, failed to react, the cancel culture could be described and defended in a liberal jargon, in the concept of rights. Those who cancel Western culture reclaim the rights. Those who defend this culture are qualified as defending deeply entrenched privileges. This has always been the weakness of liberalism, that they thought the burden of the proof is with those who want to preserve the status quo, not with those who want to change. In the light of liberal dogmatics, the Black Lives Matter revolutionaries at Princeton have the right not to be humiliated by the name of Woodrow Wilson among the Princetonian greats. And the right will always unweight the rights of those who would like Woodrow Wilson to stay. The assumption, one of the silliest that liberalism has ever instilled into the modern mind, is that these changes are usually based on the new rights granted to new groups. These changes make the world more diverse, open, and pluralistic. It can be compared to a belief that smashing a China set will generate multiple China sets. America without classical studies, with classical studies devoted to slavery, America without Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Robert E. Lee, will it be a more culturally spacious place? Will it be many China sets, or will it be rather a collection of broken fragments? The answer is simple, and I do not exclude that some of the cancel culture warriors would answer correctly. Yes, what has been happening is the destruction of culture, not the creation of diversity. It is about smashing a China set, not producing multiple China sets. But suppose my diagnosis is correct about the three roots of cancel culture, liberalism, neo-Marxism, and egalitarianism. What would be the answer to the question that has been frequently asked? Was it bound to happen? Was it necessary that the combination of these three trends, three orientations, lead to an open assault on the entire Western culture? The answer is obviously not. But the answer is self-evident. It does not explain much. Of course, that could have been another historical scenario. Of course, the Enlightenment did not have to generate terror, guillotine, and disgraceful events in Saint-Denis. Of course, Marx's works did not have to result in the Bolshevik Revolution, in the Gulag, and China's Cultural Revolution. What is more important, and how easily this cancel impulse is ignited among the culture elites, or to use a French fancy expression, among the bien-pensants, and how weak are the critical reactions to it from this group. In fact, there is a strange alliance between this group and the mob as its executive arm. This alliance existing during the French Revolution, Sexual Revolution, and today. One has a feeling that this part of the elite either supports the revolution or quiesces to it, has abandoned the essential part of that cultural heritage, that it should continue. The word culture etymologically is related to cultivation, a slow and laborious process of preparing and approving ground on which plants grow, or slow and laborious process of preparing and improving human mind and imagination, which produce works of art and works of intellect. Once we realize it, we immediately become aware that the word cancel is the very antithesis of it. One cannot cancel the culture of plants because it would ruin cultivation. But for some reason, cancelling in the realm of ideas has been regarded as laudable. In fact, all philosophical and ideological concepts which I indicated above as being behind cancel culture, egalitarianism, liberalism, and Marxism, make the process of cultivation rather controversial and problematic. On the other hand, cancelling, subverting, destructing, deconstructing, remodeling, debunking, these are, from their perspective, far more natural reaction to culture than cultivation. Hence a natural attraction between the elite and the mob, between those who destroy and those who provide arguments for destruction. So to conclude why it is true that one might imagine a different scenario entailed by egalitarianism, liberalism, and Marxism, the one that has unveiled itself is not only legitimate, but to a large degree expected. While cancel culture surprised, even shocked many, we should not treat it as an exceptional series of events when political passions got out of control, but there is a good chance that things will soon go back to normal. The tendency to reject, marginalize, to cancel the basic constituents of Western culture, even by brutal means, has been with us for a long time. What is remarkable is that this recent explosion happened at the time which is generally considered to be the peak of civilization, when liberty, equality, prosperity, and justice have achieved the levels unparalleled in the entire human history. This is a rather too rosy picture of today's world. Yes, prosperity is there, equality has gone berserk and devoured justice, and liberty has suffered serious setbacks recently. But what is more important, how can we recreate this sense of allegiance to the great Western tradition? This is the question to which, unfortunately, I have no answer.